Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the fourth episode of our summer series, where today I'm delighted to talk with Elizabeth Dickinson about the cartel-driven unrest in Colombia and how USAID cuts have impacted the country.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Elizabeth Dickinson has been the International Crisis Group's senior analyst for Colombia since 2019, and she's based in Bogotá. Her work centers around armed conflict dynamics in the country, organized crime, military strategy, and the implementation of the 2016 peace accord between the Colombian government and militant guerrillas. She leads ongoing work around defense strategy reform and regional drug trafficking. Prior to joining the International Crisis Group, Elizabeth worked for a decade as a journalist, including roles at Foreign Policy Magazine, The National, and The Economist. Let's listen into the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity, and I'm excited to be joined today from Bogotá by Elizabeth Dickinson to tell us about a little bit of background into Colombia and what's going on there today. So, Elizabeth, thanks for joining us.
It's really great to be here with you. Thanks for the invitation.
So, to start us off, I think it'd be pretty good for our listeners to get up to speed a little bit on Colombia's recent history. So, a lot of folks listening will have heard of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, better known as FARC, and their decades-long fight with the Colombian government that revolved a lot around the group's exploitation of the drug trade and things like that. But there was a peace deal in 2016 that saw the group formally disband. So can you tell us what led up to the peace agreement and how did the president at the time, who was President Santos, pull that off?
So the former FARC were a leftist insurgency that was sort of a classic insurgency of the Cold War era, formed in the 1960s, a strong sort of Marxist-Leninist ideology, built very much on rural reform, particularly, and the empowerment of poor farmers. They fought essentially half a century of conflict with the Colombian state. And in the course of this long conflict, I should note here, importantly, beginning in the late 90s with very significant U.S. support, the Colombian state and the FARC had reached what was essentially a tactical stalemate, where the FARC could not be defeated militarily, but at the same time, the FARC were essentially blocked from growing further. That was, I think, a necessary condition to drive us to the possibility of talks, which began, first of all, behind the scenes, and then finally came into public light, resulting in the 2016 peace agreement. This was an organization that controlled at its height between 20 and 25% of Colombian territory.
Yeah.
So a very significant presence. It was, although not the only armed group, certainly the dominant one, with a very significant foot, as you mentioned, in the drug trade as a means of financing itself. And so what the peace deal did really was address a whole range of issues that, first of all, facilitated the emergence of this group and its perpetuation, things like land inequality, things like the illicit drug market, but then also, of course, demobilized more than 13,000 fighters of the FARC. And we should note here that this is one of the most successful demobilizations really in the region's history, with over 90% compliance of individuals remaining in the process up to this day.
So you noted that the FARC had been around for like 50 years and had kept up this insurgency, controlled like 25% of the geography of the country, and had ties to the drug trade. So that was what was funding them. But how did they have such a persistent presence in the country, and how did they sustain that? I mean, you noted the money, but was it this sort of land inequality and people feeling left out of what the government was doing, gaining the hearts and minds of folks in the rural areas of Colombia?
I think one of the ways to think about why the FARC persisted was to understand that the Colombian state has actually never, in the length of its history, controlled its full territory. These are areas where, at the signing of the peace accord, when police finally entered rural areas that were formerly under the FARC, it was the first time that some farmers had seen policemen in their entire lives.
Wow.
So this was not an issue of the FARC taking territory from the state, but rather a state that had never consolidated its control, allowing other actors to fill that space. The FARC, the former FARC, had, because of its deep ideological formation, they woke fighters up at 5 in the morning and gave them courses on whiteboards about Marxist ideology. It was very serious indoctrination. And they ran communities under those rules, including through a system called manuals of coexistence, which literally listed out rules for the society about how it functioned. And this stretched into social life, it stretched into the economy. Many poor farmers who grew coca, for example, became dependent economically on this organization because they were the buyers of a product that was sustaining their lives. The FARC charged taxes on the local population, set rules, and they were essentially a de facto government for many years in these areas. And so you can imagine that when they left, we had an enormous vacuum that was left in that space. And I think the story of where we are now has a lot to do with what's filled that vacuum in the time since.
So let's talk about that. So since the deal in 2016, Colombia's had two presidents. They had a conservative president, and now they have a leftist president, President Petro. How did both of these presidents handle the post-FARC era and sort of this broader issue of armed groups? Because you did mention it wasn't just the FARC. The FARC is obviously the best known and maybe the biggest. So how have they handled armed groups in general and the narcotics trade since the deal?
Yeah, absolutely. So the premise of the 2016 agreement, again, was to fill the vacuums that the FARC was going to leave behind and to address really the root causes that were driving this conflict. So it included things like rural reform, addressing illicit crops, ensuring political rights, rights for victims, transitional justice. It was a holistic, comprehensive deal. And I think the story that we've lived in Colombia in the years since under both presidents, then I'll talk more about each one specifically, but is really a scramble of timing. The state in Colombia, like any state, moves slowly. It's a bureaucracy. It requires congressional appropriation and sending officials into rural areas, and it's complicated to set things up and implement an agreement. Armed groups and criminal organizations who saw the opportunity left behind by the FARC, we're talking about drug trafficking routes, coca crops, of course, being the raw material for cocaine, opportunities to extort the population and extract rents, they moved much more quickly. And unfortunately, this scramble to fill spaces, I think, in the years since is where we are today. That armed and criminal groups have filled many of the spaces that the former FARC left behind, leaving the state sort of scrambling to catch up. They have outcompeted the state to govern these areas, unfortunately. The former president, Ivan Duque, who came into office actually quite critical of the peace agreement, I think despite his political critique, did some very important work in implementing some of the rural reform elements, for example, infrastructure projects, electrification, etc. Other parts of the agreement, though, I think were left a little bit more neglected. For example, transitional justice. I think the other component of the Duque administration strategy was seeing this expansion of armed and criminal groups. They leaned very heavily on the military to try to control this expansion, to try to also control coca crops. And unfortunately, I think we can say now, looking back at the evidence and the growth of these organizations, unsuccessfully tried to stop their expansion. The Petro administration, the first modern elected president in Colombian history, came to office with a different strategy. He de-emphasized military pressure and promised to negotiate with this whole coterie of remaining armed and criminal groups. So some were leftist insurgencies like the former FARC. The most well-known is the National Liberation Army, the ELN. Others were more typical drug trafficking style criminal organizations. And what the Petro administration essentially said was what the 2016 peace deal did was create an opportunity for spoilers. If we only negotiate with one armed group, then it leaves the rest of them to fill the vacuum much more quickly than the state is able to. So the theory of his government was to sit down with all the remaining criminal and armed groups. Unfortunately, in practice, I think that's proven quite a bit more challenging than it sounds. So while the diagnosis was correct, I think what this government has learned is that unfortunately, I think we could categorically say all of the actors who are sitting in talks with the government have not demonstrated good faith or interest in truly resolving conflict, but rather, quite unfortunately, I think have used negotiations as a means to stall, expand, and grow. We're seeing now an adaptation in the Petro administration starting to lean more heavily once again on the military. And it's this balance, I think, between peace building and military force that we haven't quite found yet in the years since the 2016 agreement that can bring us to a more stable situation where we start to really build peace and implement the 2016 agreement while also understanding that there are real security threats that need to be managed.
So, where has this left since 2016 drug production and drug trade in Colombia? Has it become smaller? Has it just shifted who's controlling it? I also read an interesting article in The Economist a week or two ago about the increase of the gold trade and gold mining and illicit gold mining because of the price of gold and a lot of drug groups getting involved in that as well. So, where is that at the moment?
I think the story of the drug trade after the demobilization of the FARC is one of the most fascinating stories that we see today. So, as you mentioned, at the time that the FARC demobilized, they were really the dominant actor in the drug trade. So, supplying cocaine to international trafficking organizations, be they Mexican or Brazilian, moving it to the United States and Europe. So, as you might imagine, in a market, when this actor, this reliable provider of cocaine, disappeared, there was a moment of panic. And what we saw and what we've understood from our conversations in recent years with individuals close to the drug trade is that there was an enormous investment in Colombia to expand coca cultivation, to create more raw material for drugs to ensure that these international buyers would have someone to buy from.
Yeah.
So international organizations invested in creating new factions of armed groups, in incentivizing farmers to grow coca. We would hear stories at the time of farmers saying, as someone showed up at my farm, offered me this payment to start growing coca, and said they would give me an advance payment for the first 3 crops, plus fertilizer, plus inputs. It was an impossible offer to resist, not just economically, because, of course, with the history of conflict, farmers in Colombia know that an offer to grow coca is, in fact, a threat.
Right.
So the hectares under cultivation today of coca are at their highest level ever in
Wow.
Colombia. And I think part of that is the story of how do you fill that gap. We've also, frankly, seen a scramble, a violent scramble among the remaining armed and criminal groups in Colombia to be that provider, to
Yeah.
be the new main drug trader. And here I think we can say that the group that has dominated thus far is an organization known as the Gulf Clan. They call themselves the Gaitnista Army. They have a very strong presence across the entire north of the country and have become the preferred provider, particularly for Mexican groups. These are very difficult dynamics to combat, particularly because once these organizations have a foot in the drug trade, what that provides them are 2 key elements. The first one is territorial control. Coca is a product that requires vast expanses of land. You can't run the drug trade if you don't run the area it's grown in and the routes that's trafficked in. We have organizations today that really manage and control and govern territory. But secondly, they have access now to financing, arms, and criminal sophistication that has empowered and accelerated their growth into other markets. You mentioned gold. This is an extremely attractive market now for armed and criminal groups who see the drug trade as sort of their stable income, but gold is the growth market. And actually, if you map out territorial confrontations between illicit actors today in Colombia, they trace almost perfectly to gold mines.
Interesting. So, moving forward to the present, part of the reason we wanted to do this episode was because of some high level cases of political violence in the country recently. In February, for instance, fighting broke out in the Catatumbo region. And last month, Senator Miguel Uribe, who's a presidential hopeful, somebody attempted to assassinate him in Bogotá. What can we make out of the violence that seems to have increased recently? Is this kind of tied to everything you're talking about? Why the assassination attempt? Why more fighting is breaking out? What's your answer to this?
So I think there are a few things at play. The first, as I mentioned, is as these criminal and armed groups have become more empowered with greater access to illicit resources, they have felt the imperative to expand. They are businesses and they are seeking to grow their operations. And in many cases, because of the drug trade and because of the need to control mines, for example, and extort communities, that means growing and expanding and often clashing with either the armed forces or rival armed and criminal groups. So what we saw, for example, in the Catatumbo region in January was a very planned and targeted offensive by the ELN, this remaining leftist organization, to take that region, to take control definitively of that region. The Catatumbo region is a very particular place. It's right along the border with Venezuela, which means that trafficking routes there have very easy access to the Atlantic Ocean via Venezuela. It's also home to one of the what we call enclaves of coca growth, which means that the entire process of making cocaine happens in one area. It's grown, it's refined, it's produced, and then it's finally sent abroad. Timbo is one of those enclaves and perhaps the most important one. And essentially what the ELN offensive did was take that area, control it. And I think here there's an important aspect of the violence that we see today that I think is distinct from the past, which is that the former FARC were an insurgency with an ideology and a plan to take power in Bogotá. That was their ambition. The groups today have only one ambition, and it's money.
Hmm.
Their ambition today is to control territory in order to access illegal resources and to expand and enrich themselves. That is the logic that is driving the conflict. So yes, they have continue to have sort of rhetoric about how they treat the population. They continue to have political ambitions, but in the service of their economic interests. And
Yeah,
that is a significant change and has meant that the violence, the center of gravity of violence is no longer between the state and the armed group, but rather between the armed group and the civilian population. Because controlling territory, accessing illicit economies means controlling the population, submitting them to silence and ensuring that they will not be an obstacle to your permanence in the regions, which has created essentially in Colombia a very low intensity conflict, but one of very high impact for residents who today tell us that they are living one of the most challenging moments that they can remember in the conflict's history. Then we come to the case of political violence. Miguel Uribe, a candidate who was an intellectual successor of former President Alvaro Uribe, not related, the architect of many of the military campaigns that pushed the former FARC to, I think, the brink of this tactical defeat. And his real priority in the pre-election campaign had been security. What we can say about the attempted assassination, I think, is that it's very clear that whoever organized it had an intent to shape the election. And it's quite interesting that this was a message that was sent but unsigned. We don't know who the author of this attack is, which means
interesting.
it's not that the ELN is sending a message of how powerful they are. It's not, a criminal organization trying to telegraph their power and importance. It's someone who wants to change the electoral result without being the author of that change. I think this is a very dangerous moment in Colombia and really requires political maturity because Colombia has lived through moments in its history, for example, in the 1990s, where half a dozen presidential candidates were assassinated in a row by different criminal actors in ways
Crazy.
that reshaped the history here.
Yeah. So you mentioned the United States, and we know they played a major role in the 90s and early 2000s trying to combat drug trafficking and the drug production in Colombia, and then played a role in helping to facilitate the talks between the FARC and the government. The Trump administration is, at least rhetorically, talks a big game on anti-drug trafficking and mostly in line with Mexico, but I'm sure Colombia is on that list as well. So how has President Petro navigated that America relationship so far?
So under the Biden administration, I think there was actually a very excellent and pragmatic cooperation on these issues. The two sides agreed to disagree on certain aspects of the problem. Petro, as a president, for example, has been very critical of the drug regime internationally, very much in favor, questioning of prohibition, asking questions about why Latin America pays the cost in lives of the drug war fought to prevent consumption in the North. But at the same time, his government continued to cooperate with the Biden administration on a whole range of security operations, initiatives. For example, he captures within these criminal organizations, prosecutions, extraditions, also operations to strengthen the police, the military, in terms of their ability and their capacity to fight these threats. Under the Trump administration, I think we're very concerned that that cooperation could take a real hit in a way that would dramatically affect Colombia's security. And I think here I would start with the change that's already happened. The destruction of USAID in Colombia has been catastrophic. Colombia is uniquely dependent on the United States because of its long history of cooperation, as you mentioned, not just in the Peace Corps, but for more than a decade beforehand, very close security cooperation. Then, with the signing of the Peace Corps, $1.5 billion over a half a decade to fund that very important accord from the United States. The U.S. represented 70% of humanitarian financing in Colombia, a major donor in all aspects of stability. With the destruction of USAID, from one day to another, that financing disappeared. And I cannot tell you how catastrophic that has been. Colombia is a very difficult place to work. It requires building trust in areas that have lived under armed groups for decades. USAID had been a stable presence, helping these communities overcome those challenges, building reconciliation, development, healthcare, the whole range of issues that are fundamental to escaping these cycles of conflict in Colombia. From one day to another, those programs were stopped, shut down, and the trust was broken. The trust that had been built over decades. UN offices are experiencing cuts of over to 70 to 80%, migration cuts in terms of helping Venezuelans. A parenthesis to remind listeners that Colombia has absorbed the single largest share of Venezuelan migrants of any country, and the highest share by percentage of population of migrants of any country in the world except Turkey.
Wow. Yeah.
So all of that financing disappeared overnight. And to summarize what that looks like, a country that's struggling to recover from conflict, facing new cycles of conflict, what the USAID cuts did in Colombia was pull a rug out from under everything that they were building. And we're very worried about what that's going to look like. I think for now, we haven't seen that effect because it will be delayed. People are holding on to the programs by the skin of their teeth, trying to get by. Later this year, I think we'll start to see the impact of that when humanitarian organizations can no longer respond when there's a disaster, when medics can no longer have funds to go to an area when there's a massacre. These things are going to start to have a very real impact on security and, frankly, on U.S. interests.
Right. I think that's one of the key things for Americans that they don't understand, a lot of Americans, is that the work that USAID did and does affects Americans directly. And this is a case in point on how pulling USAID out of a place like Colombia, because of all the work it does there, can really end up affecting the United States, not just Colombia. So looking forward for the next year or so until we get to the elections, how do you see this kind of playing out over the course of the upcoming 18 months or so?
So there's a future U.S. policy decision that we consider to be fundamental to maintaining stability in Colombia, and that has to do with the process called certification. It's an annual process that the U.S. government undertakes to decide which countries are complying with U.S. drug policy and which countries are out of compliance. What that entails is a decision about whether or not to continue financing to those recipient countries. So now we're not talking about USAID, which is already gone. We're talking about defense funding, mill-to-mill cooperation, police support, all sorts of security assistance.
Yeah.
We're very concerned that the U.S. administration, because of its political disagreements more broadly with the Petro administration, will choose to certify it, which would have a detrimental effect, not just in Colombia, but really across the region. The important thing to understand about the closeness of the U.S.-Colombia relationship is that Colombia is the landing point for all U.S. policy in the region. So we're talking about everything from capture operations, intelligence, interdictions, seizures of drugs. Everything starts in Colombia.
Mhm.
So should the administration choose to cut that support, the U.S. would lose access to all of that capability,
Yeah.
intelligence capability, operational capability, the ability to attack and confront the drug trade for the United States would disappear very rapidly should this decision happen. This is all without mentioning the dramatic impact it could have in Colombia, a country that is so deeply articulated with the United States and its security apparatus that when I went to the ministry and asked, give me a list of programs, what are we talking about that could be affected? The answer was really everything,
Yeah.
because it's such a tight relationship that what Colombia does is deeply integrated with U.S. interests. So, just to give you a few specific examples, during the initial funding cuts from the State Department earlier this year during the review, there were specific shipments of drugs that the Colombians had on their radar screen. They knew where they were, they had all the information to go take them, and nobody had any money to act because this US financing that had put together that apparatus disappeared overnight. That was a preview of the many, many spillover effects that such a decision could have in Colombia. Entering an electoral year, this is obviously a very combustible dynamic. I think if we look at recent polls of voters, and security is among their top two concerns. Very worried about rising levels of violence, gang violence, extortion, armed and criminal expansion. And so I think the tendency in the presidential election will be to talk about a harder military campaign against these groups. And again, if we lose that important US support, there will be a temptation to discuss other options. Colombia,
Yeah.
for its own national interest, will have to start thinking about where else it's going to rely. And the debate that's opened now about whether the US is a reliable partner was really unfathomable just 6 months ago, but has recast, I think, the way that Colombia sees itself in the region and the broader hemisphere.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting 18 months. Do you have any idea on when the decision on the certification is going to happen?
Yes, legally, it has to happen before September 15th, and the date in which the president has to notify Congress.
Okay, well, we'll all be on the lookout for that. Elizabeth, thank you so much. This has been enlightening, and I appreciate the time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks again to Elizabeth for her time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.